Wild Lives by Faunographic.
Hey, I'm Rochelle and welcome to Wild Lives by Faunographic. Today we're speaking to the legendary filmmaker and photographer Bob Talbot, whose films include the Oscar-nominated IMAX film called Dolphins and also one of my favourites, the freediving doco called Ocean Men Extreme Dive. Bob's also just finished his new immersive documentary called Being Dolphin 4D, which gives viewers a dolphin's eye view of life in the pod, and it's soon going to be shown in zoos, aquariums, theme parks and all kinds of other venues all over the world. He's also worked on The Life of Pi, Into the Blue, Free Willy, Flipper and David Blaine's Drowned Alive show. It's quite a showreel. And Bob's portfolio of photos is equally impressive, with his work appearing in countless mags including Time and National Geographic. As a wildlife lover, you've probably even hung one of his prints in your home at some point. Bob was in his 20s when his posters of whales and dolphins went global and they became the world's best-selling line of marine artwork. On top of all that, his TV work has taken him to Antarctica with Jacques Cousteau, to the Arctic with Sea Shepherd's Paul Watson, and his conservation efforts have earned him prestigious awards like the Environmental Hero Award by Vice President Al Gore and even the Seakeeper Award by Prince Albert of Monaco. Yeah, it's pretty fair to say that Bob has lived an incredibly wild life, and we're stoked to have him with us today. Thank you so much for your time today, Bob. We're thrilled to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Now, you were born in California, where you became a certified diver at the age of 13. Then at 14, you went whale watching for the very first time. Why was that so special?
Wow. Well, my buddies and I that I started diving with, we had this dream of seeing whales in the wild. So we taken this little inflatable boat and followed a whale watch boat out of Dana Point in California. And it was really foggy day. We hardly could keep the whale watch boat in sight, and before long we had lost them. So we cut the engine and we could hear whales blowing all around us, but we couldn't see them. And so we sat there and we would start the engine and move towards the sound and cut the engine. It was like out of a movie, you know, and then before we knew it, one surfaced right next to the boat and his blow was like an explosion, scared the hell out of us. It was so humbling, that experience. But ironically, it kind of left me feeling more connected to the sea than ever before. Yeah, I know that might sound kind of strange, but there was something about being on that little rubber boat in the fog and having this huge animal right beside us that made the ocean feel very real to me. And at the same time, left me with this kind of overwhelming desire to share that feeling with everyone else. In your early years, you were quite fascinated by the work of the legendary Jacques Cousteau, and in fact, later in your life, you got to work with him, which must have been amazing. But as a young diver, how did those kind of adventures inspire you at the time? Well, actually, it inspired me long before I started diving, because the first episode of Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau aired when I was like 10 years old. And though I was already interested in the ocean, you know, that ignited a flame in me that continues to this day, and not just me, millions around the world. You know, I think you can go to just about anybody that's spent their life in and on the ocean for the last 30 years, and in some way you'll find that they were inspired by Cousteau. And I think that was because he was much more than an explorer. He was a consummate filmmaker. He was a poet. He was really a master communicator that captured the hearts and minds of millions of people. And it made it seem possible that, yeah, we could go out in the ocean and have these adventures and encounter these animals and maybe, in some small way, affect the way people look at them. So after you graduated high school, you and some friends loaded up that inflatable boat you mentioned before. You put it on the back of a Datsun, which in Australia we call a Datto, and you drove all the way to Canada. You went to Vancouver Island to shoot your encounters with orcas. Tell us about that. You know, it's funny the dumb things you do when you're young. So this guy I started diving with was named Tony Bernat. We met in junior high school and started diving, and from that time we were obsessed with diving with orcas. But you know, our parents were driving us to the beach on the weekends to go diving, and we couldn't very well ask them for a ride up to the Pacific Northwest. And the idea of even mentioning to our parents that we wanted to jump in the water with an orca was kind of nutty. But by the summer of '77, we'd saved some dough, and you know, we were 19 years old, and we thought, you know, let's go for it. So we drove up to the Pacific Northwest with no idea exactly where we were going or what we would do once we got there. Now, keep in mind, this was long before the internet, so we didn't know a single person who had seen orcas in that area, much less dove with them. So it was nutty. I kind of think sometimes about if one of my kids had asked to do that at that age, it's just like, no way. You know? But anyway, we did. And in Tacoma, we met a guy named Mark Oberlin who had spent some time in British Columbia with orcas. And so he joined us. He was our big expert, and he was the old man of the crew. I think he was 23 at the time. And we finally made our way to San Juan Island. And that's where we met Dr. Ken Balcom, who was kind enough to take us out with him on one of his research boats for a couple of days. But we hit him in a dry patch, and we didn't see a single orca. So all along the way, this new guy, Mark, kept talking about a place called Alert Bay off northeastern Vancouver Island, and about some treehouse built by another orca researcher named Paul Spong, Dr. Paul Spong. So at this point, we had burned through just short of half of our dough. We were just about out of money, considering we had to get home. And now we were talking about committing to a series of ferry crossings and making our way up these logging roads at Vancouver Island to God knows where. And so, of course, a sensible thing would have been to remain on San Juan Island and wait for the whales. And, of course, we set off for Alert Bay. So once we got there, we launched an inflatable, and we just, I'm sure I have a picture of it somewhere, but this boat was barely floating under the weight of all our camera gear and camping gear. And we all kind of sat on top of this mound of stuff and headed out looking for this tree house on Hansen Island. And, you know, it's, for us at the time, just being there was amazing. You know, going through this maze of forest-covered islands and, you know, this saltwater waterways where abundant was marine life on the edge of this great forested islands was just amazing. And so eventually we got to Hansen Island, and we got around this small point, and there was a little cove there. And there above this rocky beach, perched in the trees, was Spong's treehouse. It was like out of a storybook. You could hardly believe your eyes, you know. It was pretty crazy. And so we got inside the treehouse, and there was a little note that Paul had left to anyone who happened upon the place to feel welcome to stay. And so we moved in. And we were probably there for just short of 2 weeks. We'd load up the boat every day, going out looking for orcas. And finally, one afternoon, we had a pod along the shoreline of Vancouver Island. And, of course, we were out of our minds with excitement, so much so that we could barely take a picture. And we finally got it together, and we hung out with the pod for a while and took a few photographs. And there was one that afternoon that I remember that kind of stood out was the orcas were lined up abreast of one another, and the sun was setting behind islands, so they had this nice, strong backlight, like a lot of the photographs I've been seeing you post lately. and their glows were just illuminated by this backlight, which I know is, you know, commonplace now, but then I just hadn't seen it, you know. And, you know, I saw the shot, I was kind of bummed because it was overexposed, and it wasn't very, you know, wasn't composed very well, but it really made an impression. So anyway, so we had that afternoon, and now we were on a mission to get in the water with these guys because we were running out of time. So we only had one other encounter with orcas the time we were there, and on that day, Mark had maneuvered the boat out in front of a pod, and they approached, and we thought, okay, they've gone past. And then just a short distance away, they surfaced again, and at this point I had my wetsuit on, but I didn't have any other gear on, and there was just no time. I grabbed my mask, and I pressed it against my face, and just, you know, rolled off the side of the boat, holding on to the lifeline on there, and peered off into this kind of murky green water. And then off in the distance, you see these white forms begin to appear, and you don't know if you're looking at heads or tails or what you're looking at. And a moment later, these two orcas appeared out of the murk and were swimming past, which for me was the ultimate experience of my life at that point. And then one turned and started swimming directly toward me. Now, you got to remember, this was in the 70s, and everything was kind of, there was a lot of kind of metaphysical, New Age kind of things going on in relation to whales and dolphins. And I remember one person had told me, you know, when you see them, don't put a camera in front of your face because it'll block your vibe, you know, that sort of thing going on. And there was part of me that wanted to believe that these just, you know, gentle, sweet animals that like people. And then there was probably a part that was kind of rising up from the limbic system saying, hey, that's a big predator heading towards you, and you're a meal, you know? So I was a little indecisive. I was kind of pulling myself up and keeping myself down and pulling myself up, and I finally decided, hell with it, I'm staying. And he swam right up to me and kind of stopped and He gave me this big eyeball and headed off on his way. And I was just excited, as you can imagine, getting back into the boat. We tried a couple more times that day. We never got in position again. And so we headed back to the treehouse. And as we were going through Blackneck Pass, where you have, it's a narrow passage with the big tide changes up there. You got a lot of whirlpools and a lot of debris. And we hit a log. We hit a log and busted the lower unit on the outboard.
Oh.
And then got towed back to the treehouse by a fishing boat and had to wait several days for a little cabin cruiser full of drunk people to take us back to their bay.
What an adventure.
So, yeah, it was something. Yeah, that's how the whole orca thing kind of started out.
You actually went back to the Johnstone Strait a couple of years later and you got some great footage of orcas while you were there, but there was an unsettling moment there for you, wasn't there? Yeah, there was. Again, I was trying to get an underwater shot of orcas, and I had this wind-up 16-millimeter Bolex camera in a housing, and so I was on a point where the orcas came by pretty frequently, and then I kind of slipped into the bull kelp bed there and waited. And as these orcas approached, I snuck out, and this mother and calf swam by as I'm rolling, and wow, I'm getting a shot. And then they turned around, they came back, and wound up the camera, got another shot, and then off they went. And so we were pretty excited about that and worked our way up the island a little more and tried it again. And this time, what looked like what I thought was the female that was we were later told was a juvenile male, which we later found out had a couple of calves, so who knows, started circling me and vocalizing and blowing bubbles. And so at first I thought, wow, this is great. I still got a few feet left in the camera, and I kept rewinding and shooting, and the whale's coming up, and right next to me, I'm able to raise the camera and come out of water with them and go down. I was having a great time, and then I ran out of film, so I thought, well, I should get back to the boat and see if I can reload, and if this whale's going to stick around. Well, the orca had a different idea, and he was like, no, you're not going anywhere. Oh.
He would head me off at every turn, and it was tightening in circles and getting closer and closer. So at this point, I was getting a little worried, and it wasn't so much worried that it was a predation scenario. It was more just worried that I was going to be a toy. And finally, the whale stopped, and it just hung there in the water for a moment and made one final vocalization and took off. So,
wow.
So, got back in the Avon, and we headed over to Paul Spong's place to tell him, what had happened. And he goes, oh, from the description, I said, oh, that's just Sharky. He messes around all the time. So,
Sharky?
Anyway, it's all Sharky. Yeah.
Well, it was on that very same day that you shot the footage that launched your film career, wasn't it?
Well, it's funny. It was on that day a lot of things happened. And, that footage actually got the attention of Captain Cousteau some years later and did have a lot to do with me kind of getting in the film. Also that day on the way back, we'd gone to Paul's, we had our conversation about Sharky, and we were heading back to camp. And at this point, it's the evening. These days are long in the summer up north, and everybody's pretty wiped out. And we were heading across the straits, and it was one of those rare afternoons or evenings where it was just absolutely glass. It was one of the glassiest days I think I've ever seen. And we came upon a pod of orcas, and they were going parallel to the island, so they were backlit beautifully with the island behind them. And so we lined up, and I was remembering that shot that I didn't quite get on our first trip, and was, determined to do it right this time, and knew that this was a pretty unique situation. I wasn't going to have a lot of opportunities. So we spent a few minutes with them, and I shot a couple images that ended up being two of my first posters, and that really kind of set the stage. So that whole day, that one day, was pretty much a milestone in my career, as it turned out.
Massive turning point. So orcas really have had a massive impact on your life. Why do you think you've had this lifelong fascination with them?
Well, to me, they are like the pinnacle of evolution. I see our planet as an ocean planet, and of all the creatures in the ocean, there are none that impress me more than orcas. And, I guess it has to do with their intelligence and that they maintain this highly evolved social order, and at the same time are cunning predators, so they can be looking after each other in this very compassionate way, and then, you flip the switch and they go into the predator mode where they can be pretty ruthless and very effective. So I guess it's that combination, and that they did play such a big part of my early years. And not to mention their form. I mean, they have such a striking form. Just to look at them, it's like looking at an incredible piece of art. And so from a graphic standpoint, you just can't help but being attracted to them.
Another animal that's played a big part in your life is the dolphin. In fact, you've just wrapped a new immersive short film called Being Dolphin 4D, which is about to hit screens all around the world. Again, why do dolphins intrigue you so much that you will make films about them?
Well, like orcas, a lot has to do with their beautiful form, the fluidity of movement, and their overwhelming sense of oneness. If you've been with dolphins, you know that a lot of the times, they'll tolerate you and they'll give you a look and then they're gone. But at the same time, there are the rare occasions where you get to be kind of an invisible guest in the pod. And those times have been very striking to me. I'm overwhelmed with this feeling of kind of oneness that these guys have among each other. It's almost like being part of a single entity made up of separate, unique individuals. This kind of a sense of unity that goes far beyond what I've ever experienced with humans. They've taken a different evolutionary path than we have. And while we're tribal and rely on each other, their reliance on each other goes so far beyond us. And that sense that they all kind of exist as one in the pod is pretty overwhelming and very attractive. And I don't know, it's that sense of family, I guess, that sense of safety they must feel within their pod. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely makes sense. One of your most famous photos, and it's one of my favourites of all time, is called Aquadine, and it features a dolphin riding the bow of a huge ship at the sunset. Can you tell us a little bit about that iconic shot and how you came to take it?
Well, it's kind of funny because I'm often asked about that shot, and there's a lot of photographs that I've set out, well, I'll say a few photographs I've set out to get. Megopter, the tail, dolphin tails is silhouette of dolphins, a particular composition, where I went out with the image in mind and just worked on that for weeks or months. With Aquadine, it was kind of funny because we had spent the day with dolphins off Southern California, and it was a really flat day. Conditions were beautiful. There were dolphins everywhere, but they wanted nothing to do with us.
Oh.
So they weren't bow riding. They weren't grouping up. I don't think I'd shot a frame all day. Now, I guess about a year before, the guy I was on the boat with and I were out, and I shot another photograph of a dolphin bow riding an oil tanker. And it was kind of high light, and it was, kind of a straightforward front-lit shot. I was packing up the sun had set, I was packing up my gear down below, and my buddy who was on the boat that other day, the year before, started saying things like, "Oh, you should see these dolphins going crazy in front of this freighter." I'm like, yeah, don't mess with me, It's a bad day, It's like, no, really, all these dolphins are going crazy in front of this freighter. I'm like, yeah. And he's like, all right, suit yourself. So I come up, and sure enough, these dolphins are just like 3 and 4 at a time are launching off the front of this freighter. So we go racing over there, and this was back in the days of film. And at the time, I would only shoot Kodachrome 64 because I needed to blow these things up, and it's the only thing that really held up well. So I'm shooting ISO 64, manual, everything, and the only lens I had fast enough was my 85. I guess it was a 1.4 at the time, which requires to be much closer to that ship than I felt comfortable. In fact, we even tried reaching them on the radio and never got an answer. I mean, if we would have lost power, they would have probably not even felt the bump, So these dolphins kept bow riding, and I shot a few frames, and that particular shot was the dolphin on his way down, because at the apex of his jump, he was kind of in a goofy position, and he flattened out on his way down. But these guys are getting quite a ride off that freighter. But it was just right place at the right time. It wasn't anything that was planned.
It's just magic. Whales also feature heavily in your work. In fact, once you had a close call with a grey whale. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Well, this was 85, and again, I was off Dana Point, not far from where I was at my first time seeing a gray whale. And we we heard a call on the radio from a fisherman calling the Coast Guard about a gray whale entangled in the net. So we got his position and said we'd come out to help, and the Coast Guard said, great, thank you. And we got out there, and I jumped in the water, and there was a gray whale wrapped 3 times, head to tail, in a gill net with a bunch of floats gathered at the tail. It was
hideous.
It was pretty horrible. I mean, this whale was mummified by this net. It couldn't open its mouth. It could barely swim. So we got next to the fishing boat, and the guy gave me a pole with a knife taped to it and said, knock yourself out. And I jumped back in, and of course, the whale wanted nothing to do with that. It was trying to strike me with his tail, moving sideways, and I thought, well, I'm in way over my head here. So I got on the radio, and I called the Coast Guard and said, look, we need some help out here. Now, at the time, there was no real protocol for whales being, to rescue whales in nets. And we waited there probably 3 hours while the Coast Guard tried to figure out what to do. And it turns out that one of the guys in the communication center knew a guy from a research facility there in Newport Beach, and they had a boat called the West Wind. So they set out to see what they could do. And they arrived on scene. I didn't know any of these guys. They jumped in the water with just wetsuits and knives. And I had a little pony bottle that I would use a lot of time with cetaceans. So I had the pony bottle on and my Nikona, so I started out taking pictures. And then I thought, well, since I got this little pony bottle on, I can stay down with the whale when it dives. It dive down 20, 30 feet and then come back up. And I can just keep working, which was not great. So I handed my camera up. I got a knife. I hung on to the whale, and there was some polypropylene line that was kind of hard to get through, and I kept sawing away as the whale dove. And then I realized the whale was getting a little agitated because I was staying with it, so I went to back away and got a couple of feet off the whale and then was slammed back against him. And I realized all this time there was a big loom of net below the whale that was drifting up over my back while it dove, and it was tangled in my tank pretty bad. So, of course, the whale became more agitated and started shaking me around like a rag doll, and I became more entangled. And then the whale surfaced, and the fellows from the other boat were across the whale from me. Now, at this point, I'm kind of embarrassed because I didn't know these guys, so I didn't want to make a big deal, and I said, hey, guys, I got a little problem here, And then the whale dove again, and I stuck my regulator back in my mouth, and down we went. Now, this time the whale was really upset and was just trashing me. And so the next time I came up, I was tangled pretty badly. I was just able to get my head up enough to for the only time in my life ever, utter the word help. Just so it was very clear that things were not going well. And it was kind of funny because there was a lifeguard boat there that had come out of Dana Point, and neither of those guys got in the water. In fact, later they had told me that when they saw me with the net over my head, they were sure that I wasn't getting out of that alive, and they weren't about to risk their lives for nothing. So, I guess it looked pretty dire from a third person's perspective as well. Long story short, this went on, and I won't go through all the details, but it ended with one of the gentlemen, a guy named Chuck Mitchell, was able to approach me and help me get out of my tank, and it was quite a struggle. I had put this piece of neoprene over the shoulder strap because it was digging into my wetsuit, which made it impossible for me to get the thing undone. Note to self, don't ever do that again. So Chuck was, working hard to get this thing off of me, and I didn't know when I was going to run out of air. My head was underwater most of the time at this point. So finally he gets the thing off, and I surface, and I was so relieved. And the lifeguard boat was right there. And as the whale dove, I felt this tug on my legs. And I just looked at them, I went, my fins. And they said something to the effect that, well, screw your fins. And I'm like, I'm not worried about my fins. I'm tangled. And I took a breath, and down I went as this whale dove. And at this point, I was completely winded, so I didn't have a lot of gas in the tank. And I was able to get out of the one fin, but the other leg was wrapped, the polypro was wrapped around my calf, and I was there was nothing I could do. And this guy, Chuck Mitchell, who I never met, who I didn't know, risked his life by taking a breath and swimming down and cutting me loose. So that was the end of that. Some days later, that whale was spotted up the coast with my tank weight belt, and I don't remember, I think it was my mask, still in the net as it swam by. I can only imagine what those guys must have been thinking. I don't think that whale survived. And the real takeaway from the story, though, was that it became a big news story. But the news story wasn't that a whale was tangled in the net. The news story was that this idiot that was trying to help the whale got tangled in the net. And I found that pretty distressing at the time, because I pushed very hard to get the idea across that, look, we have a problem here. We got to be thinking about these inshore gill nets and what's going on. And, it just wasn't the story. But since then, it has become more of a story. But the fact remains that the nets are still there all these years later. The fact remains that we have a huge problem with whale entanglements here in a national marine sanctuary in Monterey Bay. Mm. So it's a little distressing. It's a very addressable problem, especially here in Monterey Bay, because we're primarily crab traps, and the simple solution, you just don't set crab traps when you have humpback whales here. But again, fishing community seems to have a pretty strong lobby, and we have to be able to get past that.
Same problem happens here as well. We just recently had an entanglement just off Sydney Harbour where a whale was caught for hours with a fish trap attached to it. And friends of mine actually did what they could to free it because authorities couldn't get there in time, and they were able to get a little bit off of the fish trap. But unfortunately, they couldn't get all of it off before it turned dark, and then the whale just ended up having to go with it still partially on.
That happens so often here. It's awful.
It's really distressing because people are trying to help them, but then at the same time, you've got people setting fish traps right in the peak of the migration. Like, can you not just wait until the whales have gone? It's not that hard.
That's exactly right. I spent quite a few years on the board of Sea Shepherd. Here you had folks out on the high seas risking their lives to combat illegal whaling. And it just seems crazy to me when you have that going on, and at the same time, in countries where we seem to be fairly protective of whales, we allow so many whales to be killed with bycatch and with fishing gear. And there are a lot of ocean issues that are not simple. Most of them aren't. Most of them don't have a clear-cut solution. This is one that does. And anyway, that is that story.
Bob's short documentary, called One Breath, showcases his passion for Monterey Bay in California. It's an area so rich in marine life that it's been called the Serengeti of the sea, with 180 species of bird, 500 types of fish, and more than 30 different species of mammal. For a long time, the wildlife in the area was in decline, but after the sardine industry shut down in the 1950s, the animals started coming back. And in 1992, the Monterey Bay Marine Sanctuary was established. Today, it encompasses 6,094 square miles, or nearly 16,000 square kilometres of ocean, making it one of the most important protected areas in the United States. With its huge underwater canyon and sprawling kelp forests, it's an important area for humpbacks, grey whales, orcas, as well as the biggest animal on the planet, the blue whale. The sanctuary is also famous for its sea otters, elephant seals, and dolphins.
Tell us, why is Monterey Bay so special?
Well, it's a hub for marine life. We have this submarine canyon, and we get a lot of upwelling, and that upwelling brings a lot of critters to the surface, and that just sparks the food chain here. So, in any given moment, I can be looking out my window and seeing a humpback or an otter, or Risa's dolphins, or any number of bird species. It's a pretty amazing place. And for all its problems, we still have a lot of things we need to deal with here. It's one of the few stories of hope. It's one of the few places that's better now than it was 200 years ago. Now, again, you got to keep in mind perspective and context, right? There was a time here in Monterey Bay where people used to complain about the stench of whales' breath. There were so many whales in the bay. And though we have a lot of whales now, it's nothing compared to what we once had. But still, it's a success story. Elephant seals are all but gone, and they've come back. Otters were all but gone. In fact, they were thought to be extinct, and they've come back. So it shows that the sea can be very resilient. And when we decide to protect a spot, it can heal. Yeah, I'm sure there's a number of places like that around the world that I'm not aware of. This is one that I happen to, have the opportunity to visit and finally live at. And so I feel pretty lucky to be here. And I look out the window every day and go, okay, stick with the fight because it's worth it. It can change. Things can change.
Your commitment to conserving marine environments is legendary. Can you tell us how can the everyday person actually help to make a difference?
Well, you're opening a can of worms here, Rochelle. It's a discouraging fight, fighting for the environment and fighting for the marine environment in particular, because to most people, it's all out of sight, right? You look out at the ocean and it looks the same in a healthy place than it does in a place that's been pretty ravaged, short of, visible pollution like plastic and whatnot. And for most of my life, I've been very frustrated, struggling with the notion of why we do this. Why can people be so immune to what they're seeing every day? And it took me a long time to realize that from an evolutionary standpoint, we're doing exactly what we're supposed to do. Given enough time, our brains evolved to a point that we can have this impact on our environment, and our psyche is such that we're kind of short-term creatures. We're not really programmed to think long-term from an instinctive perspective. So we do what a lot of other animals do. We take all the taking's good, and, we take what we can take when we can get it. So acknowledging that doesn't really solve the problem, but maybe it gives us a different way of looking at things. I tend to be a pretty judgmental guy, and I get pretty fired up when I see things happening to animals, but I've had to temper that and understand what's going on behind it and understand what's effective. And going head-to-head with people and saying, I'm right and you're wrong, is not effective today. It used to be, but it's not anymore. It's part of our nature to resist change. And when people have come up in an environment where they see things a certain way, to simply say, you're wrong and I'm right, when with every ounce of their being they believe they're right, tends to be counterproductive. So I've come to a point where I've had to ask myself, do you want to be right or do you want to be effective? If I want to be right, then I have to acknowledge it's all about me. If I want to be effective, then maybe I'm being more altruistic and I'm thinking about something outside myself. So I think we need to be looking at these issues from a perspective of how can we work with people that are doing things that we find counterproductive to the environment of the ocean, where without judging them, we can come to conclusions and come to solutions that everyone can live with and that moves us in the right direction. It may not be where we want to be. It may not be what we feel is completely right, but it's a lot better than where we are now. And I hope we can do this. And that we need to go after issues that are addressable. There are certain areas in the world where you have people that are impoverished, that are thinking about getting through life day by day, their next meal, whether they're going to be blown to bits by God knows what. They don't have the luxury that we have to be thinking about the environment or be thinking about other species, or hell, for that matter, thinking about other people. That's a luxury we have. You got to be in a pretty good spot to be thinking about some other species. So we're fortunate to have that luxury, but we have to also recognize that there are people around the world that don't. And that in some of these areas, the issues that are facing those areas may not be the most addressable issues that we have in front of us. I feel very strongly that we need to go after what we can do and be the most effective at first. So I think these local efforts are hugely important. Again, I live in a place where local efforts has transformed this day. At the same time, I think we need to keep our eye on the bigger picture, because those local efforts will be dwarfed by the global impact we have on things, and that we need to look at those issues realistically and with an open mind and with a different perspective than we have in the past. Did I say too much?
No, not at all. Not at all. No, I think you raise a really great point in that just the way that we need to shift our thinking, and it's not an us and them thing anymore, it's all of us, and we need to widen our thinking but also start with exactly what we can affect change with right here and now personally. So I think it's a very valid point.
Well, it's certainly not a simple issue, and again, we've got here because of our nature. You know, we've got here because of what we've evolved to be, and I think at this point, it's not a matter of what we should do, but it's a matter of what we want to do. We can take the should out of it. We can say, you know what, we're doing exactly what we're supposed to do, given the course of evolution. Now the question is, with this highly evolved brain, do we want to make a decision to do something different?
I feel like I could talk to you for hours, and I probably would if I didn't have to go to
your ear for hours.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Bob. You're a legend. It's been awesome to talk to you. And
thank you.
Definitely have to have you back in another time, especially when your new website is launched and we can talk through all your incredible photos again.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
In the meantime, thank you so
much.
Thanks for listening. Now, if you'd like to stay abreast of all of Bob's adventures, do check out his Instagram account at Bob Talbot Photography. And keep an eye on that because soon enough he'll be posting info about his brand new website. Remember, for more wildlife news, travels and photography in the meantime, head to faunographic.com and I'll catch you next time.
Wild Lives by Faunographic. Follow us on omni.fm or search for Wild Lives by Faunographic on iTunes. Subscribe today and you'll never miss an episode.